Welcome to Brain in the Vat. We are delighted to have Holly Lawford-Smith rejoin us on the show. I missed the last episode where Raja took my place, and so it's just an absolute honor to have Holly talk to us now. We're going to be talking about a really fascinating topic, pornography. Holly, would you like to start with some real-life cases?
So these are two cases that I use in my book, Gender Critical Feminism, just to set up like two very different experiences that not only that women might have of the pornography industry, but that people on different sides of the debate might tend to like wheel out in favor of their position. So one is this woman, Houston, presumably not her real name. So she was a star in I can't remember exactly the title, world's greatest gangbang 500 or something like this. And the way that she talks about her, she's so enthusiastic and up for it and like really, happy about all the opportunities that pornography brings. She talks about going on the dance circuit afterwards and an action doll being made of her. And yeah, she's just really she comes across like a very empowered, passionate person who wants to be doing that. And then the sort of antithesis kind of experience is Rachel Moran, who is a survivor or some people say exited woman, so exited from the sex trade. She became homeless as a teenager and ended up in prostitution. And her story is almost exactly the opposite. It's one of kind of exploitation, coercion. She has observations about other women becoming hooked on drugs or alcohol and so on to cope. And I just thought it's useful to put these two experiences side by side to acknowledge that both kinds of experiences do exist, and that each side that tends to wheel them out, like they're not lying, that there are both experiences, but then to try to like in the chapter work through what some of the ethical issues are and maybe whether like one type of story is being used more as a cover for certain things that we should be harms we should be more worried about, for example.
So do you think that is the case? So do you think that the reality is better expressed through one story rather than another? So is the Houston case more indicative of the general experience of female porn stars, or should we think that they're generally exploited and that the Houston case is either exceptional or just not representative of what's happening?
Yeah, again, it's not I wouldn't say I've comprehensively reviewed the empirical literature such as it is, and at least I know that on prostitution in particular, the literature itself is quite compromised. It's very political. People feel strongly and kind of coming in on each side, and even the people working in the field complain about that. So I can't speak authoritatively on the proportions, but my sense is that the proportions are much higher on the exploitation, troubled background of leading people into that, I don't want to say profession, like a job. Yeah, and maybe there's some complicated in between cases. So there were a number of documentaries on Netflix for a while. Maybe they're still there. About like teenage girls, sort of poorer parts of America. I'm excited about that as like a glamorous lifestyle, but they're tracking them through and showing what that's actually like or how short the shelf life is or how it quickly turns into something quite coercive that they didn't sign up for. So things like being flown in to do a blowjob scene, but then turning up and it's this like forced blowjob, which is a very different physical experience. Yeah, if I had to guess, I would say the proportions are going to be much higher on the like Rachel Moran type side than the Houston type side. But of course, the Houstons exist. Yeah.
So there's an interesting phenomenon that you have a big gender pay wage gap in the pornography industry, in that women earn much more per scene than men do, but as you point out, have a much shorter life in the industry. I think the average was something like 3 years before they leave. And the averages obviously are going to be distorted because a lot of people, as you point out in that Netflix documentary, will start off, maybe do a few scenes, and then exit the industry, either because they
Yeah.
don't enjoy it or they don't make enough money. There are people who obviously will do hundreds and hundreds of scenes, a 10, 20-year career. I suppose one of the questions to ask is, what are the conditions that would make us think that pornography is a record of something that has happened that is immoral? And are there conditions where you could say there is nothing wrong with this? It seems like a lot of traditional pornography was made by studios, that you would have people that are employees, and that a lot of current pornography is actually self made. So people make money on
Mm.
OnlyFans. It might involve no one but the performer, that there's no intermediary party, and there's no production company, there's no madam. There is just the person selling themselves to others for a profit. And you have, again, this pyramid structure. So I imagine that there's some small number of people on OnlyFans who make an enormous amount of money, and then lots of people
Mhm.
who make almost no money. But at any juncture, of course, they can stop their account. There's no external coercion besides maybe their own financial needs.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right to note that there's like a lot of variation and maybe change over time. So what the sort of bigger companies are putting out, um, compared to even something like the newer social media style porn channels where people are just uploading amateur pornography. Of course, if your main concern, I guess from a feminist point of view, there's two angles of concern, right? One is the women who are having the Moran type experience, being abused or coerced or raped or trafficked or whatever else in the making of the porn. And then the second thing is like, what is the porn licensing or, yeah, what social scripts is it building? Like, what kind of sex is it promoting and causing in the real world? And what does that do to women or for sex inequality? But then, of course, you're like, voluntarily uploaded amateur porn, that's only gonna be reflecting, like, whatever was already in the culture anyway, right? Whereas I guess it's not Hollywood, but whoever it is that does the porn, the blockbuster style porn, that is much more, like, top down, like, they are really putting out narratives, creating the culture in some sense, or, at least creating, like, looping effects in the culture. So I think you're right to note that these are all like, and then all the way down to solo OnlyFans accounts. These are all very different types of thing. But yeah, maybe like how much do we want to argue, guess, about whether there can be like the counterexample, right? So like the good porn, like the one OnlyFans where she's 100% choosing to do that, or the Houston type case where she was really excited. And then how much do we want to talk about like porn, like the social importance of place that we're assigning to porn and actually maybe to sex? Like, why is sex so important in our current conception of the good as a society? And then how is porn relating to that? And then what's the whole ethics of how all of that needs to change? And for me, needs to change with a view to eventual equality of the sexes. So I think that's a very different discussion to the one about is some of that stuff ethically okay, just considered individually?
So I like that you've split the issue into two concerns. So there's the issue of coercive experience, and then there's the issue of the scripts playing out through porn. And I think what's nice about that is you could say that the coercive experience is not inherent to the porn. It may or may not occur, but you might want to argue something
Mhm.
stronger for the scripts that are playing out. So you might want to say, in order for the
Mhm.
porn to succeed, it would have to comply with the scripts or act out the scripts that society has deemed hot, and those are problematic in some way. Those contain within them the seeds of oppression or the seeds of inequality that women experience on a daily basis. So I think what would be interesting is to go
Yeah.
into that second, into those scripts, and try to flesh out what you think those scripts are that are being acted out or portrayed in sex.
Yeah. I think there's probably again two things. So one, like you say, is um certain sorts of, yeah, heterosexuality or heteronormativity or eroticizing the dominant subordination relationship, the way that that's going to preserve a social hierarchy. That's something that's already in place, but that porn can like reinforce through really insisting upon like that's what women are for. This is how we treat women, or hey, go out and get one of those for you to do this stuff to as well. The other thing that I think is interesting is that it can actually generate novel negative treatment of women. So this is the thing about like the constant novelty of I don't know what that psychological mechanism is called, but that it ratchets up. Like you can't just watch the same porn every night and still get off. So you're looking for novelty. There's all this sort of testimony on that, and men talking about how they'll end up watching something that really freaks them out and they're really disgusted afterwards and stay away from it for a while. So it's like that. I think I've been very interested in that mechanism, that it's like there's something almost built into the pornography industry that means it's that ratcheting up effect is going to mean that it gets more and more degrading and abusive and horrific in order to keep getting men off. And somehow, yeah, so I've got another book coming out at the end of this year that's more squarely on this topic. And I'm it's gonna be people are gonna be really mad about it, I think, but I think there should be like a reset for that reason, because it's gonna hit a ceiling and become so like terrible in what has to be done to women to keep generating that sort of novelty. And I actually think maybe we're there already, that we like, even if it's not justified to like it's yeah, a reset. That's we have to like start again at a flash of ankle being sexy and just slowly work our way back up to the bad stuff. And then maybe every 10 or 20 years we have to just start again so that we don't ever, yeah, just become this society that is like treating people like that in order to get people off. Yeah.
So you could think that pornography is going down a particular path, and you could understand it in that method. Or you could think that what
Yeah.
you've had over time is really a long tail of pornography, in the same way that if you think about mainstream television in the 50s, everybody tuned into I Love Lucy. And now if you think about Netflix, you've just got thousands of shows that cater for a variety of different interests. And pornography is like that.
Yeah.
So you're going to have pornography that is sweet and kind and gentle, and you're going to have like extreme BDSM. You're going to have videos that are aimed at the humiliation of men. So you're going to have just this plethora of stuff. What's interesting is that Pornhub produces a data survey every year where they show you by
Mhm.
country what people search for. And one of the things that you see that's interesting in countries is that there's generally a heightened nationalism. So Brazilians will have their first term being Brazilian in their searches. I
Okay.
think one of the countries that's different to that is America, where Japanese is the first term that they search for.
Right.
You might think that there's something about pornography that's inherently egalitarian in a way that's different from other representations of sexuality. So if you think about beauty contests and fashion magazines, they tend to prioritize a certain kind of look traditionally, tall, blonde,
Yeah.
skinny, whereas pornography makes room for people of all different shapes and sizes, different ages, different races, different disabilities, that there's room for that. There was a feminist magazine in the 80s that came out called On Their Back, which was sort of a move to have feminist pornography. And there are many feminist pornographers who will prioritize a certain style, format. So you might think that there's two approaches there. The one is you want a reset, and the other one might be saying make the marketplace bigger, encourage people's taste in a certain direction. I'm not sure what would be entailed in a reset. Would it be to say we need to have a national ban that all current pornography must be seized and burned, or that
Yeah.
held if you have it? Or if the reset is
Sure.
one of taste, to say what we should do is shift people's norms so that they become attracted to other things, you say, like the ankles, then that really is a marketplace way of dealing with it. To say, let's encourage people to have these different tastes. I also wonder, it seems, let's say in the BDSM case, some people are going to respond to say that they find that vile and disgusting. Some people are going to say that it's an important outlet for them, that they have these strong masochistic, sadistic desires, that being able to watch that makes them feel reflected. And that as long as you have the genuine consent norms in the BDSM community, I think it pioneered a lot of that stuff, safe words and large rule sets about what's okay and what's not okay, checking in with people, that saying that, yeah, some people might really find that stuff vile, but if they don't want to watch it, then don't watch it. Um, those that participate in it should be entitled to. And then on the scripting, I think it would be naive to think that people are unaffected entirely by pornography. I imagine that some of the data that I've seen shows that people don't necessarily, from watching violent pornography, go out and perform violent actions, but it opens up their minds about what are the kinds of things that you could do. And maybe it changes some of their desires. It's not clear that it causes real world harms, but maybe there's this argument they're
Agreed.
like symbolic harms, as you say, when one woman in a film is treated badly, that's somehow a denigration of women generally. And I wonder if you think that's going to follow in other forms of media as well, mainstream Hollywood films, that certain films are necessarily sexist, or it's a problem to produce that kind of material for the symbolic harm.
Yeah. Sorry, there's a lot there and I'm gonna forget I'm gonna forget the all of it as I talk. But one thing about the first thing you said on the kind of diversity, there is this worry, I think, again, just from a feminist point of view, that like merely turning ethnicity or body type into flavor for men, like it doesn't really address the general sort of worry that there is still a sex-based social hierarchy, and particularly that sexuality or sexual use or sexual subordination is central to women's kind of inferiority or lower position in this hierarchy. So I'm not sure how moved I am by this idea that, oh yeah, we've got like big beautiful women and like the grandmas, and it's like, yeah, like men are creative in the ways they can turn types of women into something to get off. Of course, there is more heterogeneity and diversity at the edges than just the creative ways to treat women, but I'm not sure if that kind of cancels out the main sort of issue about the social hierarchy. The second thing that I do remember that you and you might have to prompt me after that, was about how the reset works. And again, I know you were discussing this with Murray Mikola, and she seemed more willing to take a sort of dictatorial, being the social dictator and abolishing all the immoral stuff. I'm very opposed to left-wing authoritarianism, I guess I would call it. So I'm just a philosopher. I want to write these books and have these discussions and get people to see that there's a problem. And I know this probably just sounds not naive to you guys because you're rational as well, but like as a way of changing society, like, yeah, good luck. So I'm sure many people think that's super naive, but yeah, for me it is a persuasive goal. Like I want to talk about problems in heterosexual sex and problems in the equality of the sexes when a lot of people think feminism is finished now. And I want to talk about the role of pornography and prostitution as institutions and what they do in preserving the inequality of the sexes. And I would kind of hope that eventually, when men and women really conceive each other as fully human and as equals, it does become unthinkable to a man to, yeah, treat his women as equals in the workplace, but then go home and watch them just getting like brutalized in pornography. That's a sort of othering of a social category of persons that would just sit really badly with his really having equal esteem for those people at work, or really being friends with those people, or whatever else. I know you made several more points and I wanted to comment on them, but they've gone out of my mind now. Sorry.
So I suppose one question we're thinking about the effect of the pornography, as you say, is the symbolic harm stuff. And we might want to look
Yeah.
at other kinds of media on that front. And so you could take the view, it seems strange just for the man to treat his coworkers equally, regardless of their sex or their race, and then go and watch, some violent or denigrating pornography. But you can imagine
Mm.
someone who really enjoys watching action movies where they're, let's say, Vietnam War movies, and they've got lots of Vietnamese friends, but they really like watching American soldiers shooting up the Viet Cong because they recognize it's a fantasy realm, and that it doesn't change their attitudes, it never changes their behavior, that they see that as a separate place. Now, the question is whether pornography is like that. Are we watching documentary footage in a way that you might think worse of someone who, let's say, enjoyed watching real war footage of the Viet Cong being killed versus the Kubrick version of that? Or do we see pornographers as actors that they're putting on a display and they're playing into people's inner fantasy lives? In your book, you reference video games as well. So you might think
Yeah.
that's the example you give is Grand Theft Auto, and you say in the game it's possible for someone to pick up a prostitute, take them into the woods, have sex with them, kill them, and then take the money that they paid the prostitute back. Now, if someone actually
Yeah.
did something like that, we would say, well, you've done an immense moral crime and you ought to be punished. When you do it in the virtual world, we must ask ourselves, what does that indicate? Does it show that you
Mm.
have vicious nature because you love evil? They might respond, no, I would never go and do something like that in the real world. I don't love the act of killing a prostitute. But in the fantasy world, that's an entirely different thing. So, in other words, because it has no real world ramifications, I don't have a love of evil. And you might think the same of someone who consumes the pornography. They say, I would never do that to a partner. But the imagination of it, that's okay. And you might think, there's this sort of line about sexual fantasies generally that you can imagine a woman saying, I would fantasize about being raped, but I would, of course, never want to be raped. The two are completely
Yeah.
distinct things.
Yeah. But do you think, so I'm interested in your case of the guy watching the movie and it's always the same racial group. It's like, what are you imagining of his empathy? Because I get that if something's a bit off, if he's always watching the Americans like kicking the shit out of this particular racial group, and when he's watching them getting the shit kicked out of them, he's never empathizing, like, oh, it's so bad when people get murdered. Oh, that poor guy bleeding to death and the friend having to, if those are not his empathy patterns, if he's actually really, like, yeah, I get him, but then they're all great friends at work, I think I would be a bit suspicious what's really going on with his underlying like racism or racial attitude. Of course, if he's just engaging in literature where he's sad about war, like he somehow just likes those big feelings, but he's empathizing, then that's very different to porn, right? Because no one like masturbating and ejaculating to porn is empathizing with the like pain or coercion or sexual use or whatever of the woman. In fact, the whole thing of it, like it doesn't work to get you off unless you're fantasizing that she loves that. Like she's there for that. Like the whole thing is a delusion, right? That this is all something that's like really good and everyone's really getting something out of it. So yeah, I don't quite know what to make of that parallel. And I think Raja was pushing this out in our last video, right? Yeah, people can just like, be respectful to their colleague, but then go home and secretly jerk off about them. I don't think those were his words, but I think that was the flavor of the idea. But it was like, that's still different as an individual matter of respect to having that view of a whole social group. So yeah, that I'm thinking of the kind of the like fuck a bitch, what's that, like the movies where that's the thing the bros are all saying between themselves, or like the mafia men, or it's like we're interchangeable, we're completely commensurable with each other. Maybe you can't have a really fat one or a really ugly one, but a good enough one is fine. And that I don't know how you can watch her, any one of the exchangeable ones of her being used in that way, but then still kind of like unproblematic and respectful attitudes to women in your day-to-day life. And because I really care about that day-to-day life, equal humanity and equality, and I want that, I'm then working backwards to like the role of porn, I
I
think.
think what's really interesting is what the reference of the porn is. So there's this phenomenon of Hollywood law. In Hollywood, physics works differently. When a ship goes down, it pulls everyone down with them, but in real life, that doesn't happen. Physics is different, but morality is different too. Society works differently. And the question is, when we're watching a film, when we watch like an action movie and you've got the gangsters in the action movie, is that referring to gangsters in real life, or is it just referring to Hollywood law? Is it a self-contained
Mhm.
universe that we're referring to? So when someone watches porn and you talk about the fuck a bitch, are you talking
Yeah.
about women in general? Is that what people have in their minds? Is that what they're referring to when they get turned on? Or are they just referring to this trope, this almost Hollywood-esque trope in porn, and they're just getting turned on by that? And I tend to think it's the latter, not the former, and I think you're assuming the former. But what's very interesting to me is, how would you know? So it's when you talk
Mm.
about the scripts being enacted, what you're saying is, I'm going to interpret what I'm seeing as enacting certain scripts rather than some other interpretation of it, sort of a more Mark type interpretation, as when we watch porn, what we're watching is it's just imagination. It's just a fantasy. And you're saying, but no, it's more than that. It's enacting of certain scripts in society. And what I'm interested in, isn't that like an unfalsifiable claim? Isn't it unfalsifiable? What would the conditions be where you would say, okay, in this case, it's not a script, and in this case, it is? And I thought the interesting watershed case for you might be gay pornography. So I'm curious, in gay
Mhm.
pornography, let's say you have BDSM in that pornography, or just the very same sort of scenes acted out as you would see in straight pornography, but just switch out the actor from a female to a male actor. So all the actions are identical, the dialogue's identical if there is dialogue, everything's the same, but it's all male actors. Now you look at the
Yeah.
very same scene, and I'm assuming you're not going to think that the same scripts are being acted out as in the female actress's scene. And so that would make me think, okay, hold on. Are you not engaged in a totally ad hoc exercise? So are you not looking at the
Mm.
scene and projecting onto it your interpretation? But there's absolutely no reason to give that interpretation. It's totally ad hoc. It's totally arbitrary. And that's why I think you might sort of working backwards. So you've got a theory about the way the world is and saying that's being expressed through the porn rather than actually seeing that script in the porn.
Well, the worry is that, like, I have history. So I have a big piece of evidence that you don't have that I think makes your version look more ad hoc and more like trying to get them off the hook, right? Because there actually was sexism for ages, and there actually was, like, legal rape within marriage, and sexual use tropes are, like, built in all through our kind of, like, patriarchal history. So I'm seeing that stuff showing up in porn, and I'm at least just assuming that's a kind of continuity of what we have had for a really long time, and only really in the last 60 years started kind of trying to break free of in certain countries. Of course, you're right. Like, it could be that the people that made that heterosexual dominant submission porn are fully feminist and that it's just a coincidence that those scripts line up with our old scripts. But for me, I think the burden of proof is on the feminist pornography claim than the like continuity of the scripts claim. And I think this a similar kind of answer would apply to the gay porn. You're totally right that it's like it's more subversive or it's more unclear exactly what the message in it is, and maybe it's even progressive in a way. If we're used to thinking of men as taking the dominant role, interesting to see a man in a submissive role. Maybe we don't have what's our concept of what lesbian pornography would be like. But again, this whole like discussion in the second wave where some of the I mean, they weren't called that, but let's call them the egalitarian lesbians were really angry at the butch femme lesbians because they were like, you're just aping heterosexual scripts while claiming to be revolutionary. It's like, you're not. You've just turned you've turned one of your women into a man and you're just doing heterosexuality all over again, but one of you is wearing pants. It's so annoying. And that's an interesting critique too, right? So if gay men are in the bedroom, actually, this was like on I think the last episode of the new remake of Sex in the City, which is absolutely terrible. But there was a storyline in that with a older gay man and a younger gay man, and the older man said, "You can't fuck me because I don't want to be the woman." And it was like an explicit dialogue in the show that like letting yourself get fucked is being the woman because it's being this penetrated, being the submissive and so on. So can just replicate exactly these problematic scripts and it can actually still be reinforcing if the people involved think that's what it means. And you might want to make the same argument about prisons, right? It's an all male prison, but we've just got women and men like social roles replicated within the system. And in a way that's also still contributing to like women's subordination outside the institution. So yeah, it can be subversive and interesting, but can just also be like just as problematic as the original stuff.
I find it a weird narrative about the world that there's these sort of scripts that float on top of our experience that appear to, in your
Mm.
view, have agency of themselves. So it's almost like the script lives despite current experience. So in the past, there was horrendous oppression of women. I'm not going to disagree with you.
Yeah.
But you must agree that there are changes that have happened. Today, women have
Mm.
the vote. Women have a lot of laws that support their equality, at least superficially in society. I'm sure you're going to argue that there's still persisting inequalities. But the point is, there's definitely change. And the question is, on
Yeah.
your view, do the scripts then change too because circumstances change, or do the scripts live on? So the scripts, their own agency that lives on through society. And if you think about the metaphysics of that, super weird. So you've got these scripts that float on top of society with their own existence, their own metaphysics, and then society changes, but those scripts persist. That's super weird to me. So that's your interpretation. But I've got,
You are making
yeah,
it
but
weird.
all I'm doing is cashing out the metaphysics of your position. Right? And then there's
Oh,
the second interpretation of what's going on, which is there are no scripts. They don't exist, right? There's no scripts. All there is individual actions. So you've got the actress in the room and you've got the actor in the room, and the actress has certain feelings and the actor has certain feelings. And you're totally right that in some cases those feelings might be negative and she might be coerced. But I think that when that doesn't happen, when there isn't that coercion and she's not being pushed into a situation where she doesn't want to be, and all the terms are clear and she's paid very well for it, that there's nothing more going on there, that it's just fine. There's not this floating metaphysical ghost called the script that enters the scene and then somehow takes over. That's super weird to me. What is the metaphysics of this? I don't believe in ghosts.
yeah. Sorry. No, you have made it sound extremely unappealing, but it's not how I would have cashed out the position. Yes, I wouldn't have reified these things into mysterious ontological entities that come along. But you don't have to have such an implausible story, right? We have culture, we have books, the books persist through generations, we have like cultural learning, we have grandparents, like there's all these like mechanisms for learning and passing on information and sharing our histories and whatever story you'd be comfortable telling for like why there can still be continuity with certain negative stereotypes about African Americans since slavery through Jim Crow, through whatever up to like contemporary America. Just tell that story for women in whatever country. And of course, we should talk about how much that has changed. And of course, it might be that like we've had so much progress in feminism that like a lot of the ways we think about sex and what women are for and like men's attitudes to women, they might be quite different, but there's lots of plausible mechanisms bringing some of those historical ideas along. And it wasn't that long ago. Like Mad Men era was like, what, 70 years ago? It's not that long. There's still granddads alive who have that attitude to women and probably taught it to their sons. So yeah, I think you can tell it in a much more plausible way how those ideas stay around. And then the question is, yeah, for any given woman and man participating in heterosexual sex or in a porn scene, how likely is it that they're like acting on and replicating those ideas? And totally separately of that, maybe they're feminists. How likely is it that the men watching it see it as replicating those ideas? And then what role does that play in perpetuating or entrenching whatever sex-based inequalities there are still left in this day and age and in our countries?
So I want to pick up on something you discussed earlier with regards to homosexual pornography. And you give the cases of the butch lesbian playing the role of a man and maybe the man being penetrated playing the role of a woman. And I wonder how you square that with your views on gender and whether your maleness necessarily has to track with the social role. And then I also wonder if you what you think goes on in trans pornography. Are they engaged in the same sorts of power dynamics that you are concerned with in straight pornography? Do you think that the trans community get to do something that's different, that they're playing out different kinds of roles, or is everybody bound up to, as you say, play these scripts out endlessly?
No, I can't remember exactly what words I used, but I should have been very careful there. Like when the guy in Sex and the City say, I don't want to be the woman, for me, I'm like, that's very important. That's in quote marks, however he meant it, because I don't think that man and woman are social roles. And I don't have someone like Catherine McKinnon's theory of what that social role is, where it's just like being sexually subordinated or being subject to certain sorts of like sexualized misuse. So I don't think that anyone who's not female can be a woman. So I think it's just figurative in the male prison case or in the gay male case. Again, can see how something like McKinnon's view will roll like trans women of color in prostitution in together into the class that female people are in, because she'll see that as all like having the same treatment or explanation. But for me, yeah, I would just think that like adopting a presentation that leads to a certain sort of treatment And then, yeah, that's an interesting question whether it would be subversive. So if the trans woman doesn't pass, but then is in pornography, taking the submissive position, is that subversive because it's a man in a submissive position, or is it actually entrenching stereotypes because it's like he's saying, look at me, I'm getting fucked, so therefore I'm a woman. So it's actually bad for women. And in a way, that's what's at the heart of the gender critical feminist and trans inclusive feminist dispute, right? Because we want to say that's bad for women, it's entrenching stereotypes, and not just the sex, by the way, but almost a lot of the claims that trans women are making. Whereas they're going to say he is being subject to all the same kinds of mistreatment that you are. You have so much in common. Jason, I think we talked about this a bit in the last video too, right? And if there's so much in common there with the treatment on the basis of appearing female or being feminine, what's this resistance to like keeping the two separate? So I think I would tend to view it as subversive if that person didn't pass as female. But I don't know what the average person's response to that kind of category would be. And I did hear, I think it was in the Your Brain on Porn book, but I might be misremembering, that's become a really popular category of porn. And I don't know if that's just to do with the novelty thing. People are just looking for something different, or yeah, whether what's going on in this cultural moment. But I thought that was interesting.
I'm curious what you think the wrong maker is in porn exactly. So do you think
Mm.
there's thought crime happening? Are the very thoughts of the viewers or the producers of the porn the problem, or is it only the effects? So if a certain piece of pornography is watched, has all the scripts that you say exist, which I'm still skeptical about, but let's say all those scripts are there, but they don't result in anything negative happening in the world, has anything wrong happened? Or just the mere thoughts involved, the ideas involved, as you say, that's sufficient to generate a wrong maker?
No, I don't think it's thought crime, but I think you can set the bar too high for looking at what it causes. So I agree with, I think that's McKinnon's view that like it's the people used and exploited in the making of the porn that's harm side one, and then it's the what this fact of pornography as a big industry does to women's equal status. But it's like, yeah, some people want to set the bar at, and I think, Mark, you mentioned this earlier, the direct causation. Like, it's not that we can find out that something that a lot of sex offenders in prison have in common is that they watched a lot of porn. There's been empirical stuff, but it's correlation, right? It's not causation. It's very hard to prove causation. And of course, the feminists have wanted to prove it, and I was eager to prove it for the book, and I couldn't find it. So that was interesting. So the actual effect is that guy more likely to be a rapist or to abuse, do date-based sexual assault or whatever. But there's something at a lower bar that is what's it likely to do to his attitudes about women in the world, like women who he interacts with in the workplace or, yeah, in social life? Does he tend to apprehend women in a more objectified way, in a more instrumentalizing way? Does the fact of porn in general have this cumulative effect of making it much less likely that men will see women as fully human and individual rather than as this interchangeable class of things to stick the penis into? As I think that it's unlikely that it could be having no effects like that, but it is harder to spell out. Yeah, how do you test that? And maybe then you want to say your same unfalsifiable point. Well, if the guy says he's fine, then who am I like insist that he isn't? And yeah, I don't quite know how we would settle that. I guess yes, it's a very strange habit, and it doesn't exist for any other group in society that we have this like we secretly go away and like people with disabilities or people of color or any other stigmatized group that we just have this like mistreatment fantasy world, but then we all come back together. And so for me, I'm quite hung up on that. Like it's such a novel situation that we're all seeming to be fine with, but how could that be compatible with the eventual equality of women? Yeah.
There's two really interesting points. The one is there's a reason why there's no causal evidence for the harms that porn produce. It's that there's no control group. So when you're trying to come up
Mhm.
with an experiment where you're trying to prove that a certain phenomenon causes another phenomenon, you need to have two groups. You need to have one group where the phenomenon happens and one group where it doesn't, the experimental group and the control group. And there are no people who don't watch porn. So when they survey college students in order to do these surveys like they would for any other psychology experiment, they can't find any college students who don't watch porn, and so they can't perform the experiment. So the
Well,
question then becomes, if everyone is watching the porn and you're saying the porn is that bad for society, I would expect society to be a lot worse. And we obviously have different views of how bad society is. You're going to say it is that bad. And I'm going to say, well, it's not. It's sort of similar to those debates around like how bad cell phone towers are. So some people will say, well, cell phone towers cause cancer and cell phones cause cancer and the signals cause cancer. And I say, well, we're all wearing cell phones all the time on our bodies. We'd have just enormous amounts of cancer all the time. Or a similar one is that our foods now contain carcinogens because there's microplastics in them. And so we need to avoid all these microplastics because they're so detrimental to our health, but we're all imbibing them constantly. And I would expect the world to be far more unhealthy than they are.
mhm.
Because porn is so widespread and so watched by so many men, I would expect the world to be really bad if porn had any negative effect at all. And that's why I'm skeptical that it has any deleterious effect.
So what does really, really bad look like for you? Because there are certain things, and again, I don't know if I haven't seen graphs where it's like the exact year that like internet pornography took off and then comparison to things like, I mean, one thing that we know now is like rates of prosecution for rape and sexual assault are extraordinarily low and at a historical decline or whatever. What explains that? Dunno. Does the decline match up in any way? Maybe not. Maybe it's 10 years, 20 years off, and then so it needs some other explanation. But there certainly are things like that where they're related to sex and sexuality, even if not directly related to like assault incidents, where I would want to like at least check in with those historical trends. And and you can see how there would be a story to tell there, right? Like your judges or your police or your juries or whatever just have less sympathy with the idea that she didn't want it because porn is really producing this idea that she always wants it or whatever he wants, she likes. And yeah, I don't know. And or maybe you're thinking it's much more, I just keep saying it's bad for sex equality, but then you think it like, why isn't society way more sexist and misogynist? Like, how have we got this kind of what looks like quite good feminist progress alongside this kind of plobby? Yeah, but then I don't know how to tease out all the complex. Yeah, because we're also proving ourselves in so many different ways. What do you do when you're yeah, that woman just is an astronaut now, and that one's a famous mathematician, but they're also in porn, which, like, I don't know. So I don't know how you balance all those factors out at once. And then what is the average man's view of women? Maybe he just thinks some are sluts and some are mathematicians. Yeah, I'm not sure.
I like that you've said that this is so complicated. I like that. I like that view that there's so many factors here. It's hard to even assess the level of sex inequality in society. And it's hard to show how that would correlate or not correlate or inversely correlate with porn usage. I think that complexity that you're pointing out is exactly the right view. And given that, you should always err on the
Mhm.
side of liberty, which is allow people the ability to produce whatever kind of porn they want to produce, watch whatever porn they want to watch. They want in the absence of absolutely clear evidence that there is this negative impact on society.
It's just interesting, right? Because, and again, I'm just in such a like woke state that for me, that line looks hypocritical because it's like, man, there just has to be a sniff of inequality against trans people for them to pass 7 new laws making. And so then it's like, interesting that we just never take that approach to women. It's just women. Everyone else, we take that, we've just banned, you can't do the Nazi salute anymore. Not swastika's always banned, but now it's putting your arm up in a certain way in public. Okay, so a sniff of anything for any other group, ban it, but just let pornography go until decisive evidence can be. And again, I know you don't live in my state, so it's not like you're being the hypocrite. But I think that err on the side of liberty. I'm just skeptical that it's like err on the side of liberty when it comes to women's equality, but then everyone else matters maybe because they're often men. And so I'm just like, again, as a feminist, I'm just like, no. Yeah.
So Jason and I grew up in a country where pornography was banned up until 1992, when they started to
Okay.
liberalize by putting stars on nipples. And then what they used was gray, like what you have for like scratch cards, that you could then remove at
Yep.
your leisure later in the 90s. What's interesting is that various reasons have been given for banning pornography. Some of them are religious, some of them are for the protection of women. Then in the 80s, you had an
Mm.
alliance between radical feminists and conservatives who didn't like pornography for different reasons, but could agree on the end result to say we should actively try and
Yep.
suppress it. Now, it seems like one way to look at is there a connection between pornography and real world harms would then be over time, because different countries have taken different approaches over time. And as you point out, pornography has become way more accessible when in the internet era.
Yep.
Now, what you do find, as you've mentioned, is that over the last 70 years, the state of women's experience in the world has improved. That you've got better representation at universities, less levels of violence against women, that you get this inverse correlation. So societies that ban pornography tend to have higher levels of violence against women. Now, I don't think we could settle the empirical question, but we could ask some nice philosophical questions. So let's assume for the sake of argument that pornography does this funny thing to people, which is that it gives them a fantasy outlet that cleans up their behavior. So imagine a world in which men and women really have achieved the utopia of equality. They treat each other with mutual respect, similar to the world in which you envisaged in our last episode, where you don't have these strict sort of gender roles, but people watch the most repulsive pornography that you can imagine, right? That the way for them to ventilate all of their inegalitarian desires is to watch that sort of material. Men and women alike, they watch all this sort of stuff. And you can imagine let's say it's all done with perfect CG. So there's no human being who's ever involved
It's
with it.
just
So there's no
yeah.
worry about, people being involved, being exploited. We just have the scripts writ large. So whatever filthy sort of scenario you can imagine in your head that you think of as a danger because it could cause real world harms, I'm going to say it doesn't cause any real world harms. And it does the reverse. People go, oh, I really got that out of my system because I watched that vile pornography, and now I can go back to treating men and women in my life with absolute equality. Are you okay with that scenario? Do all your objections to pornography then disappear?
And so you're imagining it's not that there's generated porn that's going in every direction. It's not that some of it's denigrating women and some of it's denigrating men and some of it's gay. You're imagining it's a sex equal society, but the porn preserves the old script. It's always men fucking women and everyone's getting off on that, but it's completely insulated from their attitudes somehow. It's the yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. I think my resistance is, could it be insulated? But that's not an objection. It's if it really is insulated and somehow that's just what gets people off, like historical like oppression porn. Yeah, that's what it would be like. Yeah, racial equality societies just secretly watching this came up in our last interview too, like just secretly watching slavery videos when they go home and really enjoying them, but being completely committed to racial equality in their daily life. Yeah, it's true that I think the thing that really matters is the social equality. So I would have much less of an objection. And it certainly would be more of a like moralistic thought crime flourishing style objection if I had one at all. So yeah, I think I have to say that's not a problem, but just in my suspicion that it could ever like why would those people be getting off on that if they really saw each other as equal? What is it that could make that appealing or exciting and wholesome in a way? Like yeah, and the racial case helps me think about that. Like, how could you think that was a terrible thing that happened in history and really like fully see that other person as human, but kind of go, oh, that that's that thing that used to happen. Yeah, I find that really hard to.
One way to think about it is that human nature is complicated, that human sexual desires are complicated, that
Mm,
attraction and repulsion might sit next to each other, that if you coldly describe sexual acts, they often sound incredibly repulsive but are exciting in the moment. I have a close
yeah.
friend of mine who's a black woman who has spent an enormous amount of her life fighting against racial injustice, who has said that one of the things that she finds hottest in bed is to be racially abused. Because it is different to her ordinary views, that it is a complete fantasy world. And to be called
Yeah.
items of racial abuse that if anyone else called her that in the real world should be shocked by, but in the bedroom says, that's exactly what turns me on. And that a lot of people have these sorts of strange desires, right? What they do in the bedroom or fantasize about are very different from their ordinary lives. There's a kind of classic trope of the strong businessman who likes hiring a dominatrix to fuck him with a dildo, right? Like people
Yeah.
like to subvert the way they act in the one world because of the fantasy world. So it doesn't strike me as an
Yeah.
insane thing to think that your fantasy world could be different from your social world. And I think when you accept that the thing that matters is that we actually treat each other with mutual respect. Fantasy life
Yes.
stuff, maybe you'd prefer it in a world where everybody had purely egalitarian fantasies too. But if the causal connection runs the other way, I think you know which trade off you would make.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And I agree empirically. Yeah, taboo stuff can just be exciting or thrilling, whether it's in the sexual domain or not, right? So it's just, I can see more now how it could be conceivable, like this post social hierarchy society still somehow finds a thrill in the thing that is somehow forbidden or was in the past. So yeah, if it's really got no connection to how people treat each other, yeah, I think I would have to be fine with it. And especially like you say, if you sidestep the industry exploitation problems by making it computer generated. Yeah.
So we'll remove ourselves from the utopia then, just for a moment. So we're back in the real world, a world that you feel has sex inequality of a certain degree, and pornography contributes to that. Question
Yeah.
whether you think that heterosexual sex is sexist in and of itself. So
Yeah.
whether a man fucking a woman, because that's the example you gave earlier, is in itself, if that was filmed, that there's no way of getting around the fact that there's a problem. I'm curious whether that's your view. Okay, now a lot of people are just going to disagree with that, right? So they're going to say, okay, if all of this presupposes that the heterosexual sexual act is misogynistic or sexist, that's such a strong position that, if you're relying on that position, you're relying on a more implausible premise than your conclusion.
Yeah, no, and I've had this criticism today because in the book that's coming out later in the year, we've just had a foreword written by a guest contributor, and her criticism was, "You've what is that called? Using a hammer to crack a nut or whatever. Like you've used a way stronger argument than you need. Like you've argued against pornography by arguing against sex. That's a very unnecessarily strong. Yeah, but the problem is, I am I arguing against sex, and that is why partly why I think we have this is always the thing, right? When you live in a society in which something is normal, you want people to change their perspective on that thing, but you just sound like an absolute lunatic and madman because you're like, whatever, stop eating animals, stop using slaves, stop oppressing women. You sound like a madman until people come on board and change their views, and then they look back and then they're like, "Oh, yeah, like, we shouldn't have been doing that." I do think that. I think that, like, our long history of male dominance, and sexual use has led to certain sorts of social practices around heterosexual sex that make it very much centered on male pleasure, and I think that the, like, inequality and instrumentalization and domination of that are ethical problems that we should be discussing as feminists. And I'm particularly interested in the fact that in the second wave, sex was on the agenda for discussion. And it was very much a part of like the things that they were talking about. The lesbian separatists talked about that. And there was the whole discussion about how much sex could be, like, is it all really ethically compromised and getting close to right? That was the caricature of the Dworkin and McKinnon view, and somehow that just fell completely off the feminist radar with this like sex positivity, super empowered, casual sex, third wave view. And I think there's a bit of a backlash against that now because some people are starting to point out, like, well, we just sold you a narrative of empowerment where women then had to adjust to men's sexual demands in a way that, like, maybe is now creating a lot of stuff that women aren't really it's not good for women or women don't really like. So Louise Perry talks about this a bit in her last book. So I don't know. Yeah, I just wanted to get back on the agenda, and maybe I'm doing it in a bit of an overly troll type way, and I'm probably going to get a lot of people saying I'm a dickhead. But yeah, it is my view. Yeah.
I feel like if there's one thing we can achieve from this recording today is that we get Jason to pledge to never have sex with a woman. I think that would be a really good move towards equality.
I just want to push that. So do you think whenever a man has sex with a woman, it's impermissible.
Impermissible. And this is the thing again, right, about me not being a dictator or a policymaker. What would I like? I would like people to agree with me. So I'd like them to be rationally persuaded by my arguments and be like, "Oh yeah, that's true. Like I do always have sex like heterosexuals. Yeah, that isn't that weird? Like penetrative sex plays a really large part in our relationship, but she can't even come that way. I've been doing that for 20 years. Like, what a great revelation and what a great, oh, I've just been doing social inequality in my relationship and expecting her to be fine with that for how long? That would be good. And then maybe there's a big discussion about what pleasure should look like. And again, I think gay people probably are a really good model because, and I think it's different as well. I think lesbians, and again, it's not like I'm an expert, but I think the reciprocity is much more you turn take, right? Because you can't do the thing together really unless you're careful. Of course you can, but you tend to turn take more. And I imagine with gay men, there could be more mutually enjoyable use. Like I know the sauna phenomenon or whatever of just like giving someone a blowjob. If you like giving, you don't necessarily have to be reciprocal every time. But I imagine a lot more of the casual encounters as well are genuinely like closer to equal proportions of time, and it would be unusual to not both get off unless you really got off on getting them off, and that's just not the heterosexual model actually, in I think most of the sex that's happening in most of the world is gonna be like 90-10 in terms of the pleasure proportions and the use, and so that would be a good conversation to have in this, like, solving something ethically difficult that we don't really talk about, and actually eventually adding more not just equality, but maybe eventually like more mutual pleasure and joy or something like that. That's good, right? Like,
Yeah, the gay
yeah.
case is very interesting. I think you both right and wrong. So you're wrong on the physical acts that happen, but you're right on the pleasure distribution. So the physically, a lot of gay men, there's this wonderful joke amongst gay men. There's a lot of gay men that call themselves versatile, so they can either be a bottom or a top, so a giver or a receiver, and that they're equally happy with both.
Yeah.
And if you speak to gay men, they'll all tell you that those people don't exist. That gay men are actually far more likely to either be a top or a bottom. And that distribution is very different in different countries, which is very interesting as well. But
Okay.
the point is that there's a lot of men who are just bottoms or far prefer being bottoms, and they just want to receive. And do they experience pleasure
Yeah.
from that? They say absolutely they do. But there's not a physical reciprocation. They won't top as often as they'll bottom. They just want to bottom. They just want to receive.
But when they bottom, are they just getting fucked or are they also getting like a hand job so both parties are
So the true bottoms, the platonic ideal form of the bottom does not even ejaculate. They just bottom, and
oh,
this is a very common experience for bottoms where that is the pleasure is in pleasuring their partner. Their pleasure is being a receptacle for this, and they love it. They're called power bottoms, and they love
wow.
this, and it's a phenomenon, and it's kind of deal bottom, and a lot of bottoms strive to be. And they'll tell you that any like ejaculation that happens on their side is absolutely incidental to their pleasure. And that's very interesting to me. And
Wow.
so
Okay.
what's interesting to me about it is that is the model that I think women should be adopting. So the model that they should be adopting is I find this pleasurable regardless of whether I have an orgasm or not. I find it.
A lot of them have adopted it. So I think that's super interesting, and I didn't know that. But my worry is a lot of women have adaptive preference to themselves to that situation. And I've talked to some who, yeah, they do. They love to get fucked or whatever, and they don't. Of course, yeah, they don't get off, but that's not the point. They felt fulfilled, and but I think that's an adaptive preference. Like they just aren't demanding equality. So it's very
Yeah. And
interesting
there's
if
that criticism
gay
in the gay world too. You get the same criticism. So you get criticism of those bottoms saying, actually, the reason they're doing that is they have some sort of sexual dysfunction, they have erectile dysfunction, they can't top. And so they've taught themselves that in order to enjoy sex, they have to perform this role. And there is that criticism. They'll tell you that's not the case. They'll tell you they're very psychologically healthy. They could top if they want to, but they don't want to. And I just find this very interesting. I think it's an interesting open question is how should you interpret
Totally.
this? Is there something bad happening to this
Really.
person or is it totally fine? And it's actually, they're liberated. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I'm very interested in the answer to that question because, yeah, I think my impulse would be to read it the same way. Yeah, at least when that's with women, they're not brave enough to, like, even if they get used like that, they kind of wish they like get her off at the end, and then he doesn't even bother doing that. And then it's like, for fuck's sake. So she wants to get brave enough to get used, but then at least get off. And so my impulse would be to be like, he should at least start to have the like bravery to demand that at the end. And then, but of course, the conditions are so different. You're right. If it's all more voluntary and consensual and there's more equality between the two persons, so there aren't those script. Yeah, maybe that is possible. And then, and maybe it does cast into doubt my insistence that like women are really being wronged by this treatment by men. Because I do think they are.
See, there's a
Mm,
couple of ways to look at your concerns. The one is that would it be better if heterosexuals had better sex? And then you have a particular view
mm.
on that, which is an orgasm centric view. In other words, wouldn't it be better if women came more?
Well,
And that might not be what people's necessary desires are, as Jason points out in the gay bottom case. And the other one is that no, it's not about pleasure. It's about the sex act itself, that the sex act itself is wrong. And then it seems like what we have is two people who are perpetrating a crime that you might think of the male as the primary perpetrator and the woman as the accomplice. And that
yeah,
women have a duty then to not have sex, regardless of their own sexual desires. As much as they would like to have sex, they are wronging other women or society in general by engaging in it. And that every
yeah.
time they have sex, regardless of their consent, regardless of the amount of pleasure they have, they ought not to be doing it.
Yeah, and people are just gonna hate this idea, right? But there is something there's something in it, right? Even the complicity idea, right? Because it's like everyone that goes along with that is making it harder for the next person to have egalitarian sex and locking in the delaying the future where the relations of the sexes change. So, yeah, that I should correct. It's not quite that I want like just more orgasms. Because I think then there's some problematic implications of that, right? That are like, yeah, like the sex is always better no matter how abusive it is if it just has that added in. But I do want more mutual and like equally divided like time. I think time on each person's pleasure or what they like and what gets them off. And I think that time itself tends to be very unevenly divided. But yeah, I do think there's an interesting question of the I'm focusing more on the male being in the kind of sex hierarchy position of power and tending to run the fuck or whatever. He does, I think, bear more responsibility for using her in that way. But of course, she is not just a passive victim, right? And she's often wanting to be there or she's picking him up at the club or whatever. So there is a question of like how much of a role she has in demanding that goes better. Yeah, I just had this interesting discussion with a woman on the Colette podcast where she said, and I don't know if it's just her or like her age group being more empowered to like demand that sex goes differently and better. So she didn't seem to really resonate with what I was describing of it, heterosexual sex. And that was interesting to me too. It might be that there's been quite rapid like generational change.